in this new story. A forgotten winter incident recorded in an old county archive still raises questions about a lake house found half frozen during a historic storm. Investigators who later revisited the file admitted that several details continued to unsettle them despite careful reviews and steady cross-checks. Ryland Keats was 36 and worked as a custom woodworker who often stayed near remote lakes to sketch designs when his schedule finally slowed. He planned a quiet weekend away from clients and rented a small lake house managed by an older couple who lived several miles down the shoreline. The couple noted that Ryland seemed calm and said he hoped to enjoy a frozen lakeside walk before snow deepened across the region later that night. He arrived at the house before dusk and placed his sketch bag near a window overlooking the lake, which reflected sheets of early forming ice. Weather alerts shifted rapidly that evening when meteorologists warned of air pressure collapse across the county, which could generate dangerous gusts. Ryland attempted a brief walk along the frozen shoreline, but turned back quickly after hearing loud cracks traveling beneath the surface of the ice. He contacted the property owners by radio to say he would stay inside until daylight because the temperature had dropped faster than expected. The owners logged the call and mentioned that previous storms once caused strange echo patterns across the lake due to the ice reacting to pressure. The incident began when the owners attempted a routine check later that night and received only faint static along with short metallic pulses. A ranger named Mallory Sabin was on patrol nearby and overheard clipped transmissions that sounded like someone speaking under severe interference. She tried raising Ryland twice, but his signal dissolved quickly, so she drove her snow-capable truck toward the lake house despite worsening visibility. She later reported that gusts pushed ice fragments across the road and forced her to stop several times as shifting snow erased tire tracks ahead. Mallory reached the house after dark and noticed an unusual blue glow flickering through the frosted window, which resembled a lantern struggling. She knocked and called Ryland's name because property records confirmed he was the only guest staying at the lake house that weekend. There was no response, so she tried the door, which opened without resistance, even though the hinges were nearly frozen from the rising storm. Inside, she saw Ryland's jacket on a chair and his sketchbook open on the table, displaying a half-drawn shoreline image that stopped abruptly. The lantern on the counter flickered strangely while Mallory inspected the room and attempted to understand the heavy quiet that filled the house. She called for Ryland again and moved carefully across the floor because thin frost had formed on the boards near the back door earlier that evening. A mug of cooling coffee sat beside a scattered pencil set, and a single boot lay near the hallway, which suggested hurried movement. Deputies later observed that the back door showed a narrow ice seam along its edge, which indicated it had been opened briefly during freezing gusts. Two deputies arrived and began searching the lakeside in slow expanding arcs, though their lights struggled to cut through drifting powder. They found footprints near the back porch that led toward the frozen lake, but the trail vanished where the wind had swept the surface clean. Deputies noted the prints were uneven, as if Ryland had changed direction suddenly or slipped where ice formed ridges under the fresh snow. They attempted to follow the faint path, but retreated when loud groans echoed across the lake, suggesting unstable ice beneath their weight. Inside the house, investigators documented scattered belongings, which indicated Ryland had started packing before stepping outside unexpectedly. His phone rested near the lantern with a cracked screen and displayed a half-written message that ended mid-sentence during interference. The message referenced a deep thud outside, which he believed came from shifting lake ice reacting to sudden changes in temperature. But investigators discovered no crater or collapse in the ice near the house, which forced them to question whether the sound had originated elsewhere. Environmental sensors around the lake recorded a brief pressure dip during the same time Ryland drafted the message, though the cause was unclear. Experts explained that lakes sometimes emit strong acoustic shocks when rapid temperature changes cause layers of ice to buckle under tension. However, a house inspection revealed a warped floorboard near the back entry, which did not match typical swelling caused by cold exposure. Deputies examining the interior walls found frost patterns shaped in long vertical lines, which suggested a sudden airflow surge inside the house. At sunrise, search teams returned to the frozen lake, where visibility allowed them to identify old guide stakes placed along a historic walking route. One stake near a small inlet leaned at an unnatural angle, and beneath it they found a torn scrap from the lining of Ryland's missing glove. The scrap was lightly frozen to the ice, which implied it had been exposed only briefly before overnight snowfall covered the lake. This discovery directed teams toward a series of narrow cracks that extended from the inlet into deeper sections of the frozen water. A volunteer team followed the cracks carefully and located a shallow indentation where someone had slid or fallen based on surface scratches. They also found a small hand radio half buried in frost near a break in the ice, which matched the registration number assigned to the lake house. The radio showed deep scratches and a bent antenna, which indicated hard impact likely caused during a fall rather than intentional use. Divers later searched beneath the break, but limited visibility and shifting ice prevented a thorough inspection of deeper sections of the lake. Investigators theorized that Ryland stepped outside after hearing the deep thud he referenced and attempted to determine whether the ice was shifting. They believed he approached the lake's edge during a temporary lull and misjudged distance because whiteout bands obscured the shoreline. He likely slipped along an ice ridge and slid toward the inlet, where the surface cracked under his weight during the most intense winds. Teams expanded their search radius for another day, but new fractures formed across the lake, forcing them to halt operations for safety. Weeks later, audio technicians revisited Ryland's final radio attempts and isolated a strange harmonic resonance behind his voice. The tone resembled a layered echo that did not match typical interference caused by weather patterns over frozen lakes. One analyst suggested the sound might have come from stressed ice plates striking each other in rapid succession, though he admitted the timing felt off. Another believed the resonance resembled an underwater pressure fluctuation, though no equipment existed at the lake to confirm such activity. Investigators continued reviewing notes from the house, including frost lines, warped boards, and unexplained temperature fluctuations. Some experts proposed that a rapid pressure burst through the inlet could have forced cold air into the house, creating vertical frost streaks. Others argued that the warped floorboard suggested localized vibration strong enough to disrupt the house structure briefly during the storm. None of the theories fit perfectly with sensor records, which remained inconsistent during peak storm period due to equipment failures. Later interviews with previous winter visitors revealed that strange acoustic booms occasionally echoed across the lake during sudden freezes. Several described moments when ice plates shifted and sent sharp pressure waves toward the shoreline, though none mentioned structural effects. One visitor recalled the lantern inside the lake house flickering violently during a past storm, which matched what Mallory observed on arrival. These accounts supported the idea of unique lake conditions, but still failed to explain the floor distortion found during the investigation. A geological survey conducted months later identified several deep fissures beneath the frozen lake caused by long-term structural changes underwater. Surveyors suggested that rare pressure events might occur when unstable ice layers collapsed under shifting weight during extreme cold snaps. They believed such pressure bursts could generate the sounds Ryland heard, though they emphasized that events strong enough to deform a building were unusual. This theory aligned with some evidence, but still left major questions unanswered, especially regarding the warped floor and sudden airflow patterns. Despite extensive efforts, investigators agreed that Ryland most likely slipped into the frozen inlet after approaching the lake during unstable conditions. Whiteout gusts combined with shifting ice would have created disorientation and masked dangerous sections where cracks formed beneath accumulating snow. However, the unusual frost patterns inside the house and the warped floorboard continued to unsettle specialists who studied the case years later. These anomalies appeared in the final report, which labeled the precise trigger for Ryland's exit as unresolved due to conflicting evidence. Seasonal crews installed warning signs along the inlet, urging winter visitors to avoid the frozen lake during rapid temperature shifts. The lake house owners updated their safety guidelines, advising guests to stay indoors during sharp pressure changes detected by regional sensors. Training programs across the county reference the case to demonstrate the sudden hazards associated with frozen lakes during severe storms. Yet the puzzle of Ryland's final moments remained open for debate among investigators who believed key atmospheric details were still missing. Experts who revisit the file today agree that the case endures not because of impossible theories, but because of small, unexplained contradictions. The harmonic audio resonance, the warped floorboard, and the frost lines inside the lake house each resist simple interpretation. Most investigators conclude that Ryland likely suffered an accidental fall while attempting to understand the deep thud he heard outside that evening. The case endures in local memory as a haunting reminder that frozen lakes can hide unpredictable forces capable of overwhelming even careful visitors. In this new story, archived Winter Patrol summaries describe a remote ski lodge where several visitors reportedly vanished during January storms across multiple decades. Officials never confirmed foul play, which left the lodge classified as a low-priority site despite the strange overlap in dates. Old regional bulletins noted that each disappearance occurred within days of the first heavy snowfall, which created a pattern difficult to ignore. Ronan Kessler, a 36-year-old field technician, received a routine task on a freezing morning when his supervisor asked him to inspect abandoned power lines near that ridge. The request surprised him because the site had not appeared on maintenance schedules for years. He prepared his truck with insulated gear, his weather-worn notebook, and a sturdy radio known to survive interference. The early sky looked pale and washed out, which usually signaled an incoming storm building behind the mountains. He drove up the single-lane access road, which climbed steadily until trees vanished behind blankets of white. Drifts covered the route, which forced him to stop several times to clear ice near the wheel wells. When he reached the last turn, he saw the lodge looming through shifting snow. The structure looked crooked from years of neglect, yet fresh footprints led directly to the warped front door. That detail unsettled him because archives mentioned no active crews assigned to the lodge during winter. Ronan stepped out while the wind whipped icy flakes across the ridge. He approached the entrance slowly since the wooden deck creaked under his boots. A rusted metal sign hung sideways above the door while strands of caution tape fluttered against a railing. The smell of cold pine mixed with a faint chemical scent that reminded him of old industrial labs. He hesitated before pushing open the door, which groaned loudly under layers of ice. Inside, he found a lobby coated in dust and frost. Faded ski posters sagged from the walls, and a collapsed rental counter leaned at an awkward angle. The chemical odor strengthened, which made him breathe shallowly through his scarf. He stood still to listen for movement because abandoned structures often held unexpected hazards. The silence felt oppressive and heavy, like the lodge was absorbing sounds rather than echoing them. A sudden metallic clash rang from a far corridor, which made him tighten his grip on the flashlight. Snow blew through a cracked window, adding a restless whisper to the emptiness. He said quietly, "Hello," while hoping to flush out any squatters. No answer came, which increased his concern. He walked toward the noise with careful steps because uneven floors hid under piles of broken plaster. Halfway down the corridor, he found a steel grate leaning against the wall. Its weight and finish did not match the lodge design, which suggested someone installed it recently. Behind it, he saw a narrow maintenance stairwell missing from old blueprints. He documented the discovery with several photos, then stepped back because the chemical smell grew overwhelming near the stairwell opening. Steam-like condensation rose upward, which felt too warm for an abandoned building in deep winter. Ronan returned to the main corridor and entered a storage room where the door hung crooked on a single hinge. A tripod stood in the center of the room with a camera aimed at a roughly cut hole in the wall. Dust covered everything except the lens, which shone clean in his flashlight beam. The battery compartment sat empty, which suggested deliberate removal. He wrote a quick note in his book about the setup because the arrangement looked designed rather than accidental. A heavy thump sounded from the upper floor, which shook loose frost from exposed rafters. Ronan flinched, then steadied himself before climbing the staircase. The wooden steps bowed under his weight, which forced him to test each board before moving forward. On the landing, he discovered rooms stripped nearly to their frames. One room held several winter jackets arranged neatly along a wall. The jackets looked too new for the lodge and showed no signs of mold, which indicated they had not been here long. He checked a tag that matched a model released only a few years earlier. Near a toppled dresser, he found an emergency service patch tucked between floorboards. The fabric looked clean, which meant someone had dropped it recently. He placed it inside an evidence envelope because the detail felt too important to ignore. Outside the window, he saw the storm intensify until the sky turned white. Snowfall thickened to the point that distant tree lines disappeared. Ronan followed smaller footprints leading toward the lounge where skylight glass had collapsed into hardened ice. The prints cut through drifts before stopping at a kitchen door. He opened it and found a metal table dragged across the floor, leaving long scrape marks. Beneath the table, a wooden hatch stood open, which revealed a stairwell carved into darkness. The chemical smell rushed outward with surprising force, which made him recoil. A faint cough drifted up from the stairwell, which made him freeze. He whispered, "I hear you," and waited. A weak voice answered with a strained plea for help. He descended cautiously because unstable structures could collapse unexpectedly. At the bottom, he found a basement lined with insulation sheets arranged almost like padding. Several portable heaters stood unplugged yet positioned in a deliberate pattern. A pulley system hung overhead with ropes stretched tightly across beams. Behind a crate, he found a woman in her early 20s slumped against the wall with frostbitten fingers and a torn parka. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain what happened. She and a friend entered the lodge 2 days earlier when they were caught in a sudden storm. They heard machinery deeper inside and approached it, believing it might lead to shelter. She remembered stepping on a section of floor that dropped suddenly, which sent her falling into the basement while her friend tried to pull her up. She lost consciousness shortly afterward. Ronan checked her pulse, which felt weak yet steady. He guided her to sit upright against a crate, then searched for signs of the missing friend. Near the pulley system, he found boot impressions similar to the prints upstairs. Scratch marks lined a wooden frame that hid a recessed pressure plate. Someone had tried to pry open the frame using a flat tool. He moved the frame aside with effort, which revealed the plate covered in dust except for a single clean fingerprint. When he pressed the plate lightly, a loud click came from the ceiling, which sounded like a mechanical trigger resetting. He realized the lodge had been altered with a system of hidden traps that responded to pressure changes and weight distribution. The craftsmanship required knowledge beyond casual tinkering. Someone built these modifications intentionally and likely over several winters. A sudden crack from above signaled the hatch beginning to close under its own power. Ronan grabbed the woman and hurried up the stairs as the door slammed shut behind them. The echo vibrated through the corridor, which reminded him of controlled mechanisms, not typical decay. They entered the kitchen where the room groaned under storm pressure. The wind roared through broken vents, which matched the earlier warm draft rising from the stairwell. In the lobby, he noticed the steel grate along the hallway beginning to slide across the floor. The movement looked unnatural because no visible motor powered it. He rushed forward while supporting the woman and jammed a fallen ski pole under the grate, which slowed its closing. They slipped past into the snow as the grate clanged shut behind them with finality. Outside, the storm battered them with bursts of icy wind. Ronan wrapped her in a heavy blanket and secured her in the truck before starting the engine. The wheels spun until they caught traction along the icy path. The descent took hours, while visibility dropped to almost nothing. The constant drum of sleet against the windshield nearly drowned out the woman's occasional murmurs. They reached a ranger station before midnight, where medics treated her for exposure. She offered fragmented details about clicking noises and shifting floors. Investigators interviewed her over several days, though her memory blurred around the moment the floor collapsed. She insisted she heard breathing near the walls during the hours before she fell. When authorities reached the lodge several days later, they found much of the mechanical system dismantled. The pulley framework remained, though the ropes were cut and several gears removed. Inspectors noted inconsistent footprints around the stairwell, suggesting someone visited after Ronan escaped. The jackets in the upper room had vanished, and the tripod camera was gone, along with the clean lens. Ronan accompanied a second team to verify details in his original report. The lodge interior looked different from his earlier visit, which unsettled him. Several rooms had collapsed ceilings that were intact days before. Marks on the floor that once indicated mechanical movement now appeared faint or replaced with scattered debris. Only the pressure plate remained unchanged, though it now sat covered with a fine layer of frost. Later analysis of regional utility files uncovered an unregistered service request from a contractor using a false company name. The request dated back many winters and mentioned delivery of specialized metal components to a site matching the lodge's coordinates. Investigators never traced the contractor despite repeated attempts. During a follow-up search, rangers found an old sled buried under several feet of snow behind the building. The sled carried fragments of rope identical to fibers in the basement pulley system. They also discovered a rusted metal frame with adjustable weights similar to early counterbalance prototypes used in training facilities many decades earlier. Ronan provided additional notes describing temperature shifts he felt inside the lodge, which suggested hidden vents still operated despite no visible power source. Technicians checked for backup generators but found none. They concluded that stored mechanical energy might have powered some of the systems, though no clear explanation emerged. The missing hiker eventually recovered enough to share more details. They remembered hearing rhythmic knocking sounds shortly before becoming separated. They believed the sound came from within the walls, though investigators could not confirm it. The hiker recalled climbing through a tight service gap before blacking out on the ridge, which explained their location when found. Local residents discussed the incident throughout the season. Some believed the lodge served as a clandestine workshop for an unknown engineer fascinated with pressure-triggered traps. Others suspected the place was used as a winter hideout by someone who did not want company. A few claimed older generations whispered about strange noises near that ridge long before the lodge existed. Ronan avoided the site after his final visit because every clue pointed toward deliberate manipulation rather than random decay. The combination of warm drafts, shifting floors, and automated grates suggested a creator who still visited during heavy storms. He often replayed the moment the grate moved by itself, which convinced him the system remained active even after partial dismantling. Authorities secured the area with new barriers and updated warnings. The lodge still stands, buried under January snow. Windows rattle during storms, which gives the building a faint pulse, like a living thing adjusting to winter pressure. Those who approach claim the lodge feels watchful. The basement stairwell remains the most disturbing feature because even sealed doors cannot hide the subtle warmth drifting upward long after all mechanisms supposedly stopped. Ronan believes someone mastered the rhythm of storms and used the lodge to test ideas during the quietest nights. The deeper truth remains locked within those walls, where sound, machinery, and winter silence blend into something quietly waiting for the next January visitor who wanders too close to a place that never fully lets go of its secrets. In this new story, archived travel notes from cold region patrols mention a winter road exit where visitors reportedly vanished during heavy storms each January. The incidents share subtle similarities, which led locals to warn travelers about taking that route after dusk. No official conclusion ever linked the area to crime, which kept the road open despite unsettling reports. Clara Haldren, a 34-year-old wildlife survey assistant, drove that road during a mid-January evening as she returned from a remote tracking station. She planned to reach her lodge before nightfall since blizzard warnings suggested dangerous winds by midnight. Her assignment involved recording migration data, which required several hours in snowy terrain. By late afternoon, the sky turned darker than expected, which convinced her to take the faster exit toward the valley. The road narrowed as she approached the turnoff, where a leaning sign barely remained visible through swirling frost. Patches of wind-carved ice stretched across the asphalt, which forced her to slow her truck. She noticed tire marks moving toward the exit, despite local warnings posted on bulletin boards in nearby towns. She had heard stories about sudden whiteouts that formed without warning near the valley, but she never experienced one herself. Clara turned onto the exit, which dipped into a hollow between tall ridges. Snow absorbed nearly all sound, which gave the empty road an unnerving stillness. Her headlights caught glimpses of broken guardrails, which suggested others had struggled with the sharp curves. She breathed slowly while gripping the wheel because something about the air felt heavy. She checked the clock and noted she still had enough time to reach her lodge if the weather held. A faint flash reflected in her side mirror, which made her glance backward. For a moment, she thought she saw another vehicle, but nothing followed her. The hollow deepened until the ridges blocked the last hints of daylight. She continued carefully while her radio crackled with static. She tried adjusting the frequency, but the distortion grew louder until she shut it off to preserve concentration. As she neared the midpoint, she saw an overturned snowmobile lodged against a half-buried mile marker. She stopped her truck and stepped out into wind that bit through her jacket. The vehicle looked recently abandoned, which meant someone had been traveling this route despite community warnings. She called out anyone out here, but her voice faded quickly into the storm-filled air. She examined the snowmobile and found a torn glove caught near the ignition. Fresh footprints trailed away from the scene toward a gap in the ridge. The steps looked uneven, like the person stumbled repeatedly. Clara debated searching farther, but darkness pressed in fast, which made her decide to continue driving and report the discovery later. She returned to her truck, but before she could start the engine, a dull mechanical hum drifted across the hollow. The sound came from deeper along the road, which confused her because there were no structures nearby according to regional survey maps. She started the engine and followed the route slowly until she saw a faint orange light blinking in the distance. The light remained steady as she approached a wide bend where snow piled high along both shoulders. At the bend, she discovered an abandoned road maintenance trailer with its hazard beacon still running. The trailer door hung open while snow drifted inside. Her breath caught as she realized the beacon could not have lasted long in such cold conditions. She approached the trailer and saw scattered tools on the floor, including a cracked radio handset. A notebook lay half buried near the wheel, with entries mentioning repeated signal interference along the exit. As she flipped through the notebook, she found a page describing faint vibrations in the ground during certain storms. The writer mentioned hearing muffled clanks like large metal parts shifting beneath the road. Clara frowned because no underground structures existed in this region except old drainage channels long since collapsed. A sharp gust of wind slammed the trailer door, which made her jump. She returned to her truck and continued driving because the storm intensified rapidly. Snow fell so heavily it appeared as a wall of white ahead of her headlights. She slowed to a crawl and kept both hands tight on the wheel as she followed the faint curve of the asphalt. The ground trembled lightly beneath her, which reminded her of the notebook entry. She dismissed the idea because she believed the wind caused the shaking. A shadow crossed her headlights, which made her hit the brake. A lone figure stood near the shoulder, wearing a winter suit covered with frost. Clara rolled down her window slightly and called, "Do you need help?" But the figure remained motionless. She stepped out cautiously and walked toward them with her flashlight held steady. When she reached the figure, she saw the suit was empty. It hung on a crooked pole that had been planted in the snow. A small handwritten tag on the collar read, "Do not follow the lines." The message unsettled her because it sounded like a warning written in haste. She turned back toward her truck when the ground vibrated again. This time, the tremor felt rhythmic, like machinery running beneath frozen soil. She knelt and placed her hand on the snow, which gave a slight pulse. Her breath quickened as she looked around the hollow, now swallowed by dense, blowing snow. She hurried to her truck, but before she could enter, she heard a deep, metallic shift to the east. The sound carried through the wind like a massive gate sliding along rails. She could not see anything past the storm, but she sensed movement in the valley. She entered the truck and locked the doors while trying to think clearly. Her headlights flickered as if something interfered with the electrical lines. She tapped the dashboard, then noticed faint lights appearing ahead on the road. They flickered irregularly, like small beacons activating in sequence. The lights formed a line that guided toward a narrow pass between the ridges. Clara refused to approach that direction because locals frequently reported strange sightings near that pass. She reversed slowly while trying not to lose traction. The lights brightened briefly, then faded until darkness returned. The vibration beneath her truck continued for several minutes before stopping entirely. She took this brief calm to turn around on the narrow road, which required precise steering due to steep snowbanks. As she maneuvered her truck, the beam of her headlights crossed a collapsed service gate near the slope. She had not seen this gate earlier, which meant either snow covered it before or something triggered a shift that exposed it. She walked closer and found tracks leading inside a shallow service tunnel cut into the ridge. The tracks appeared similar to those from the abandoned snowmobile. She snapped several photos and backed away because the chemical scent of old fuel drifted from the opening. She returned to her truck, hoping to escape before the storm worsened. As she drove upward, the ground vibrated again, though softer this time. She kept her focus on the road until she reached the valley rim, where wind cleared some of the snow. From this angle, she saw faint glimmers below which matched the blinking beacons earlier. She paused briefly because the pattern formed straight lines that cut through the hollow in unnatural alignment. The moment she looked down, a loud clank echoed across the valley, which made her flinch. The beacons vanished instantly, as if someone shut them off in unison. She accelerated toward the main road while gripping the wheel tightly. The exit curved toward safer terrain until she reached an old ranger turnout. She parked beside the shelter and caught her breath. Inside the shelter, she found outdated emergency logs describing similar winter vibrations recorded years earlier. One entry mentioned a collapsed engineering project that attempted to construct a hidden supply tunnel during a past decade. The project was abandoned due to repeated cave-ins and unreported injuries. After reading more, she realized the collapsed network sat directly beneath the exit she had traveled. She left the shelter with a deeper understanding of the hollow. The underground structure might have partially remained intact, which explained the vibrations and moving air currents. Yet the functioning beacons and shifting patterns suggested someone continued to monitor or access the network despite its unstable condition. Clara reported everything to regional authorities after reaching her lodge. Investigators visited the exit days later when the storm cleared. They found the snowmobile missing along with the abandoned maintenance trailer. Only scattered tools remained frozen into the ice. The pole with the empty winter suit had fallen into a drift, and the tracks near the service tunnel had vanished under fresh snow. Survey teams detected slight subsurface cavities below the hollow, which matched remnants of old industrial tunnels. They also documented faint metallic debris buried deep under compacted snow, which suggested past attempts to reinforce underground sections. No modern machinery was found, which left the source of the vibrations unresolved. Locals continued to warn travelers about that exit each winter. They claimed the hollow changed during storms. Some believed shifting pressure reopened parts of the underground network. Others thought an unknown group used the tunnels secretly during harsh weather. Travelers who ignored warnings sometimes reported lights moving in patterns along the valley floor, though no proof ever surfaced. Clara kept her distance from the exit after that night. She felt certain someone maintained parts of the collapsed network. The beacons and rhythmic tremors convinced her the hollow remained active during storms. The winter road exit still cuts through that valley and remains open each January, despite repeated warnings whispered in nearby towns where people remember the old project and the long, silent tunnels that still breathe beneath the project. Snow. The strange events linked to a winter motel. The isolated stretch of highway leading toward the northern peaks remained a silent witness to the brutal winters of the territory. A single automated security camera sat perched atop a weathered steel pole near the remote boundary of a roadside motel. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor the vacant parking area. Local law enforcement rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant incident or a missing traveler was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in January of 2022, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary. Silas Thorne was a 42-year-old maintenance technician who worked for the Regional Department of Transportation during that year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated mountain pass corridor. The drive took nearly 3 hours, and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of ancient cedar and fir. Silas reached the base of the pole and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy snow. Silas decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still focused. He saw the familiar gray pavement and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around. A small white sedan was parked on the narrow shoulder of the road just past the edge of the motel. The car had its hazard lights on, and the driver's side door was left standing wide open toward the forest. Silas felt a slight chill because that section of the highway was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if the driver was standing near the vehicle alone. The white sedan was still there, but the open door was now closed, and a dark figure stood near the trunk. The figure appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and it was pulling something heavy out from the shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty camping trunk. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 5 minutes. The third photo showed the white sedan pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the mud. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the grass was still flattened near the trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the metal guardrail and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something was dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of ferns. Silas found the camping trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and heavy branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in realization. He used his radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the time and the place. The officers noted that the white sedan did not have a visible rear license plate in any of the frames. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the heat died. The police realized the driver must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the road camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the car. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance systems. He did not realize that the remote traffic camera was set to trigger every minute regardless of any motion. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the entire case. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The winter motel was now clear of the mystery, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely road. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The automated camera still stands on its steel pole and records the passage of time, one frame at a time. It captures the fog and the trees and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the deep woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might catch. Final footage from the camera reportedly showed that the suspects had used the motel as a temporary landmark for their activities. Witness statements gathered later mentioned a white sedan frequenting the area during the hours after midnight when the highway was empty. Dispatch logs confirmed that no service calls had been placed from that vicinity for over 48 hours before the find. The investigation concluded that the thieves had intended to smuggle the artifacts across the northern border by the end of winter. This case remains a prominent example of how routine data maintenance can expose secrets hidden in plain sight for years. The recovered items were documented in archived calls between the museum and the Regional Recovery Task Force as being priceless. Silas often thinks about the moment the progress bar reached 100% and the thumbnail first appeared on his screen. The cold air of the mountain pass still carries the memory of that day when a machine captured the truth. He continues to maintain the network of cameras with a diligence that ensures no detail is ever truly lost. The forest remains quiet now, but the record of the winter motel is preserved in the Regional Safety Archives. The story of the stolen artifacts serves as a reminder of the historical significance buried within the small mountain towns. Students now visit the museum to see the displays that were nearly lost to the black market forever. The regional board implemented new protocols to review all storage errors manually to prevent similar incidents from going unnoticed. Silas is often cited in training sessions as the primary example of a technician who performed his duty with excellence. The highway continues to wind through the pines, and the camera continues to click in the silence of the night. Every minute, a new frame is added to the digital history of the Northern Corridor for the safety of all. The record of the world grows steadily as the machines watch over the lonely places where humans rarely venture alone. Silas knows that the truth is always there, waiting to be found by someone with the patience to look closely. The mystery of the winter motel is solved, but the watch over the mountain highway will never truly come to an end. The silence of the pines is now filled with the knowledge that the past is finally safe and secure. The warning, hidden in a camper's last dashcam footage. The presence of a dashcam often provides the only objective record of what occurs when a person disappears into the wilderness alone. In many cases of missing hikers and campers, the final frames of footage contain subtle details that authorities originally missed during the initial search. A small silver vehicle was found abandoned at the end of a Forest Service road in the spring of 2022. Inside the car, a dashboard camera was still plugged into the power port, despite the battery of the vehicle being completely dead. Lyle Hendricks was a 48-year-old freelance photographer who specialized in capturing rare nocturnal wildlife in the high desert. He arrived at the remote canyon entrance on a Friday afternoon with the simple goal of setting up his motion cameras. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year, and Lyle expected to stay at his campsite for at least 3 nights. He carried a professional-grade camera bag and enough water to last for several days in the dry heat of the canyon. The landscape was rugged and filled with deep sandstone cracks that could easily hide a man from the view of a helicopter. As Lyle drove his truck along the narrow dirt path, he noticed a series of strange markings painted on the rocks. He followed the winding road until he reached a flat clearing where the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff. The dashcam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect the area before the sun began to set. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the brush near the base of the cliffs. He returned to the truck and checked his GPS unit before realizing that the signal was fluctuating wildly for no reason. He sat in the driver's seat and the dashcam captured a strange humming sound that seemed to be coming from the ground. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind that day. Lyle reached for his radio to call the park dispatch office, but only static came through the small speakers of the unit. He found a piece of notebook paper and wrote a quick note about a light he saw reflecting off the canyon walls. The handwriting on the note was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle parked had been the site of several unexplained disappearances since 1975. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple campers reported seeing figures that moved without making any sound at all. Search teams arrived at the clearing 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but found no signs of a struggle or injury. They found his camera equipment sitting on the ground, but the memory cards had been removed from every single device in his bag. Lyle picked up his dashcam and realized it was the only piece of hardware that still had a recorded file on it. The photographer had decided to keep the dashcam running through the night to capture any movement in front of his truck headlights. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the internal microphone picked up a rhythmic clicking. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the vehicle one last time to investigate the source of the noise. He walked toward the edge of the clearing and disappeared from the frame of the dashcam as the clicking sound grew louder. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working monitor and watched the final 30 minutes of the dashcam file with the volume turned up. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a metal door latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the canyon floor. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of any hiker they had seen. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn someone about a danger approaching from the hills. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the ground even when the moon was hidden behind the thick clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mentioned similar shadows being seen by a group of geologists working in the same sector. Lyle Hendricks reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer to his car. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the clearing that night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the windshield to develop a network of fine cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the undercarriage of the abandoned truck. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a strange biological mechanism. The camper whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high beam lights of the truck. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the battery to die so the clearing would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the vehicle with incredible mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Hendricks had originally concluded that he likely fell into a deep canyon crevice while hiking. However, the details on the dashcam suggested that the camper was being actively hunted by something that understood how his technology worked. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped recording at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of a person. The sound was sharp and sounded like bone striking against the metal frame of the heavy silver truck. The final few seconds of the video contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the lens from the outside. Lyle shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the surrounding air. He mentioned that he was going to try and run toward the cave system he had photographed earlier that same day. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the car alarm being triggered. Silence filled the room of the station as the screen turned black, without any more images of the canyon or Lyle. The sheriff contacted the Forest Service the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the internal storage of the camera. A technician named Silas Vance examined the digital files and confirmed that the footage had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the clearing together to look for the cave system Lyle mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the sand that contained a series of sketches and a broken lens. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the jagged canyon floor. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of a cave with glowing patterns etched into its gray, translucent skin. Silas noted that the broken lens had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Lyle Hendricks had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that has been here since 1900. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in the light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the dashcam footage remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Lyle Hendricks often thinks about the quiet photographer and the warning he tried to leave behind for others. The video serves as a haunting reminder that the desert holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by those who carry cameras. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind at night. The clearing remains empty and avoided by locals, but the dashcam still holds the final warning of 2022. The final radio check from a remote mountain pass. Search and rescue logs from the winter of 1988 contain a series of confusing entries regarding a high-altitude pass. These internal documents describe a situation where physical evidence simply vanished into the thin air of the northern wilderness. Gideon Vance was a 54-year-old heavy equipment mechanic who spent his summers repairing remote cellular tower generators. He was a man of few words who preferred the isolation of the high country to the noise of the city. Gideon lived in a small cabin on the edge of the national forest and kept his truck in perfect working order. One frigid morning in November, he received a call to check a failing backup battery system at the Summit Pass. The drive usually took 4 hours through winding dirt roads that were now covered in a thick layer of fresh snow. He packed his heavy tool bag and checked his two-way radio to ensure he could stay in contact with dispatch. Gideon pulled his four-wheel drive truck onto the logging road and noticed the sky was turning a dark shade of charcoal. He reported his departure to the base operator and mentioned that the wind was starting to pick up near the timberline. A loud static burst from his dashboard radio made him reach for the volume knob as he climbed the steep grade. He listened closely, but the sound was not coming from the dispatcher or any other authorized frequency in the mountain range. Gideon pulled over to the side of the road and adjusted the antenna to get a better signal from the valley. He heard a faint, rhythmic tapping that sounded like someone was hitting a metal pipe with a heavy wrench or hammer. The mechanic decided to step outside to see if the noise was coming from his own engine or the nearby trees. The mountain pass was completely silent, except for the sound of his own breathing in the cold and biting mountain air. He looked toward the jagged peaks and noticed that the clouds were swirling in a way that looked almost like smoke. Gideon got back into the warm cab of his truck and realized that his radio was still transmitting a heavy signal. He picked up the microphone and asked if anyone was on the channel, but the only response was the strange tapping. The tapping on the radio changed into a low-frequency hum that made the plastic dashboard of his truck vibrate softly. Gideon checked the battery voltage on his diagnostic equipment, but the readings remained steady despite the strange interference on the air. He knew that his equipment was rated for extreme weather and should not be reacting to a simple mountain winter storm. The hum on the radio stopped abruptly, and a voice began to recite a series of 6-digit geographic coordinates. Gideon grabbed a notepad from the glove box and started writing down the numbers as they were spoken by the voice. He looked at his topographic map and realized the coordinates were pointing to a location exactly 2 miles ahead of him. The mechanic put the truck in gear and slowly drove toward the coordinates while the voice continued to repeat the numbers. He rounded a sharp corner and saw a silver utility van parked in the middle of the narrow and snowy road. The van was covered in a thick layer of frost and appeared to have been sitting in the pass for weeks. Gideon stopped his truck and walked toward the vehicle with a sense of caution that he had developed over many years. He looked through the passenger window and saw that the interior of the van was completely stripped of its original seats. The back of the van was filled with large racks of recording equipment that were glowing with soft green and blue lights. Gideon noticed a heavy black cable running from the van into a deep hole that had been drilled into the rock. He followed the cable to the edge of the cliff and saw that it descended into the dark and foggy canyon. A sudden movement in the driver's seat made him jump back and reach for the heavy flashlight on his work belt. The man in the driver's seat was wearing a thick parka and held a radio microphone in his gloved right hand. Gideon knocked on the glass and asked the man if he needed any help with his vehicle or his radio gear. The man did not move or blink his eyes as he continued to stare straight ahead at the snowy mountain peaks. Gideon opened the door and realized that the figure in the seat was not a person, but a lifelike plastic mannequin. He felt a wave of confusion wash over him as he looked at the intricate wiring connected to the mannequin's head. The recording equipment in the back of the van started to spin, and a high-pitched squeal filled the small space. Gideon reached for the main power switch to stop the noise, but the metal casing was too hot to touch safely. He heard his own voice coming from the speakers in the van describing his departure from the cabin that very morning. The recording was playing back the exact words he had spoken to the dispatcher only 3 hours earlier in the day. He scrambled out of the van and ran back to his truck as the wind began to howl through the pass. Gideon grabbed his radio and tried to call the base station to report the strange vehicle and the automated recording gear. The radio in his truck was dead, and the display screen was cracked as if it had been hit with force. He looked at the silver van and saw that the lights inside were now flashing in a rapid and erratic pattern. Gideon slammed the truck into reverse and backed away from the site until he found a spot wide enough to turn. He drove down the mountain at a dangerous speed and did not stop until he reached the ranger station at the base. The mechanic ran inside and told the duty officer that there was a strange van broadcasting private signals at the summit. The ranger looked at the logs and told Gideon that the road had been closed for 3 days due to ice. The ranger agreed to follow Gideon back up the mountain pass to see the vehicle and the suspicious electronic recording equipment. They drove for an hour through the deepening snow, but they found the road to be completely empty and undisturbed ahead. There were no tire tracks in the fresh powder, and the silver utility van was nowhere to be found near the cliff. Gideon showed the officer the spot where he had parked, but the snow was smooth and white without any marks. They walked to the edge of the cliff, but there was no hole in the rock and no black cable. The ranger told Gideon that the thin air and the cold must have caused him to experience a brief hallucination. Gideon reached into his pocket to find the notepad with the coordinates he had written down during the strange radio event. The paper was in his hand, but the ink had faded into a series of blurry gray smudges that were illegible. He tried to explain that he had heard his own voice on the recording, but the ranger was already walking away. Gideon went home and sat in his quiet cabin while he listened to the silence of the woods outside his window. He turned on his home radio and searched the frequencies until he found the channel he had used that cold morning. There was nothing but the sound of the wind and the faint tapping of a metal pipe against a heavy frame. He realized that the coordinates he had followed were not for a physical location, but for a specific point in time. Gideon never returned to the mountain pass and sold his truck to a local scrapyard a few weeks after that. The cellular company investigated the battery failure at the summit and found that the equipment was in perfect working order. No silver van was ever registered in the county, and no reports of missing mannequins were filed with the state police. The records from that day were filed under miscellaneous interference and were eventually destroyed to make room for new digital files. Gideon Vance lived the rest of his life in the valley and never spoke of the mountain pass to anyone again. Some things that happen in the high country are meant to stay there among the rocks in the freezing winter air. The final radio check from that day remains a mystery that the wilderness has chosen to keep for itself forever. In this new story, archived winter maintenance logs mention an old steel bridge on a remote state route where severe icing and unexplained stallouts reportedly occur each year. Officials list the bridge as structurally sound, yet the pattern repeats every December and January. Locals warn travelers to avoid crossing it after dark because storms form quickly along the river valley, and visibility often collapses without warning. Several incidents ended with vehicles found empty, engines still warm, doors locked or left swinging open in icy wind. Marin Calloway, a 34-year-old environmental field sampler, approached that bridge during an early January afternoon while returning from a downstream water quality site. She expected a routine drive since snowfall remained light and her schedule only required one more sample reading before she reached town. She drove a sturdy four-wheel truck with insulated gear, a portable radio, and laminated route maps. Even with preparation, she disliked that bridge because the steel trusses groaned in cold weather and the deck froze faster than surrounding pavement. The sky carried a muted gray color as she climbed the winding route toward the river valley. Tall pines leaned inward across the shoulder, while thin clouds dragged along the ridgetops. The temperature dropped several degrees as she descended toward the bridge. Ahead, she noticed faint tire tracks veering near the guardrail before straightening again. She slowed instinctively since the state's winter bulletin mentioned 2 minor spinouts in the area earlier that week. When she reached the approach, she saw an empty sedan parked crookedly near the midpoint. Its hazard lights blinked steadily through drifting snow. She pulled over before stepping out to check for the driver. A strong crosswind pushed at her coat, while the steel beams above her produced a low groan. The sedan's driver door stood slightly ajar, yet no footprints led away from it. Snow should have covered them quickly, but even shallow indentations would remain visible under the slow-falling flakes. She called hello several times, but heard nothing except the river rumbling below under layers of ice. She checked the sedan interior where the key remained in the ignition, and the dashboard still glowed faintly. A small notebook lay open on the passenger seat, with scribbles mentioning a vibration felt halfway across the span. The writing ended abruptly near the words freezing up. The pages showed no signs of wet snow, which meant the driver likely wrote it minutes before abandoning the car. Marin recorded the license plate and noted the coordinates before heading back to her truck. The wind intensified as she approached the midpoint of the bridge. The steel trusses groaned a second time with a deeper tone. She slowed to listen and felt a faint vibration travel through the pavement into her boots. She stepped toward the guardrail and leaned over. Chunks of ice floated beneath winding currents, but the water remained mostly frozen. The vibration pulsed again like something thudding far beneath the surface. She stepped back toward her truck while the wind grew harsher. Marin radioed dispatch to report the abandoned vehicle, but the signal crackled heavily. Static filled the line, followed by fragmented syllables. She repeated her message and received no clear reply. Storm fronts often disrupted valley reception, yet this distortion sounded more mechanical than atmospheric. She logged the attempted call and returned to her truck, intending to cross quickly before conditions worsened. Halfway across, she felt the steering wheel jitter lightly. The vibration returned through the frame. Snow blew in shifting curtains that obscured her view of the opposite shore. The vibration grew into a steady thrum, not strong enough to shake the truck, yet impossible to ignore. She slowed to a crawl. Her headlights cut through swirling flakes and revealed a faint glow near the far guardrail. The glow flickered, dimmed, then grew slightly brighter. She braked softly and leaned forward. The glow seemed to originate near the deck surface. She stepped out of the truck cautiously while keeping the door open. The wind cut at her cheeks. She approached the guardrail and shone her flashlight downward. The beam reflected against thick ice, but a faint shimmering line pulsed beneath the surface. It moved slowly, traveling parallel to the bridge, as if following the riverbed. The pulse dimmed, then strengthened again. Marin backed away quickly. The vibration synced with the shimmering pulse, which made the steel beneath her boots tremble faintly. She reached for her truck door when a deep crack echoed from underneath the structure. The sound reverberated through the trusses like metal bending under pressure. She froze for 2 seconds before climbing back into the truck and slamming the door. She pressed the accelerator gently. The wheels spun on ice before gripping. Snow intensified into a sudden, dense sheet that reduced visibility to almost nothing. She kept her truck centered on the faint raised reflectors along the deck until she reached the opposite end. As she climbed uphill toward the turnout beyond the bridge, she noticed a shape standing near the maintenance shed. Her headlights flashed across the figure, which appeared motionless, bundled in heavy winter gear. She slowed and rolled down her window slightly. "Do you need help?" she called. The figure did not respond. When her headlights angled downward during the next dip in the road, she realized the figure was actually an empty parka mounted on a bent steel pole. The wind pushed the parka slightly, which made it appear as if it shifted earlier. A tag pinned to the collar read, "Watch the ice line." She had never seen maintenance crews mark hazards this way. She parked near the shed and inspected the pole. The snow around it showed old indentations, but no recent footprints. Inside the shed, she found an outdated maintenance log containing entries from more than a decade earlier. One page mentioned crews hearing low-frequency tremors during extreme cold spells. Another described sudden frost forming inside the shed even when heaters ran. Toward the end of the log, a note stated that bright pulses appeared beneath the ice during storms, yet no cracks were found in the bridge's support piers. The final entry ended with a reference to ice lines shifting upstream anytime temperatures dropped sharply. Wind slammed the shed door and extinguished her flashlight for a moment. She stepped outside but found the air unnervingly still. Snowflakes drifted downward in silence. The river should have produced noise, yet for a few seconds everything felt muted. A faint clicking sound broke the stillness. It came from the underside of the bridge, a slow metallic pattern repeated 3 times before fading. Marin radioed dispatch again from the turnout. This time, the signal passed through cleanly. She reported the abandoned sedan and unusual vibrations. The operator confirmed they already received partial reports of a missing driver earlier that afternoon. A unit would arrive within an hour, but warned her not to return to the bridge until the storm weakened. She waited in her truck until wind pressure shifted enough to force snow sideways. She watched the bridge through the windshield. The shimmering pulse beneath the ice appeared again, brighter this time. It ran along the length of the river as if moving upstream. The steel trusses shivered lightly, which made her grip the steering wheel unconsciously. She could not tell whether the vibration came from the ice or the structure itself. When the rescue unit finally reached the area, they located the sedan, but found no tracks leading away from it. They reported the same vibration and noted that sections of the ice beneath the span reflected their searchlights strangely. Marin gave them her notes and continued toward town with caution. Snow thickened again behind her as she drove along the ridge overlooking the river. Authorities inspected the bridge thoroughly the next day. They found no structural damage, no cracked piers, and no mechanical cause for the vibration. They confirmed mild seismic activity occurred during the storm, but classified it as normal for deep winter temperature shifts. The missing driver's notebook remained the only clue, though no one could explain the abrupt ending in the final entry. Engineers attempted to recreate the shimmering pulse by shining lights beneath the ice during later inspections, but found nothing. Local fishermen, however, claimed to see faint lines of light drifting under certain stretches of the frozen river during extreme cold. Some believed trapped algae layers caused the effect. Others said the riverbed housed decades-old drainage conduits that funneled air pockets in odd patterns. None of these explanations matched the rhythmic vibration reported for years. Residents warned travelers again as January progressed. They said the bridge changed personality during deep freezes. Cars stalled inexplicably, even with full fuel tanks. People heard tapping beneath the deck when wind pressure increased. Sometimes faint footprints appeared on the bridge at dawn, despite fresh, untouched snow before and after the prints. Marin avoided the route for weeks after her encounter. She later reviewed the maintenance log she photographed at the shed and noticed a line she missed earlier. One entry mentioned that ice shifted as if pulled from beneath the river during certain nights. The writer also noted that steel beams resonated like tuning forks when the pulses passed under the span. Each winter, the same phenomena return. Drivers report sudden fog banks forming above the deck. Some describe a faint glow beneath the ice moving against the current. Others mention headlights flickering when crossing the midpoint. No conclusive evidence explains the cause. Yet every January, the maintenance crew marks the bridge with new salt barrels, fresh cones, and handwritten warnings on orange boards. As temperatures drop and storms rebuild across the mountains, the frozen bridge begins to groan again. The vibration returns in slow, deliberate waves. And travelers crossing at night sometimes swear they feel the entire river shift beneath them, as if something deep below follows the lines of ice, waiting for the coldest moment to rise toward the surface. A dispatcher noticed an odd pattern during the blizzard. The winter of 1988 brought a storm that locals still talk about during every single heavy snow alert. Records from the county dispatch office show that emergency calls tripled within the first 4 hours of the whiteout conditions. Silas Vance was 42 years old and worked as a senior dispatcher for the rural Mountain Valley Emergency Services. He had spent 12 years answering phones, but nothing prepared him for the chaos of that specific Tuesday in January. Silas arrived at the station before dawn, while the first flakes were just beginning to cover the dark asphalt roads. His goal for the shift was simple, since he just wanted to keep the radio channels clear for the plows. The wind picked up around 10 o'clock, and visibility dropped to near zero across the entire northern half of the valley. The first strange call came through at noon from a woman who reported a stalled sedan on a back road. She told Silas that she saw a man in a red jacket walking away from the car toward the woods. Silas logged the location and sent a deputy, but the officer found the car was empty and completely locked up. The deputy reported that there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle despite what the witness had just claimed. Silas assumed the snow had simply filled the tracks in quickly because the wind was gusting at 40 miles an hour. An hour later, another call arrived from a different part of the county regarding a man in a red jacket. This witness was an elderly farmer named Arthur, who claimed he saw someone standing in the middle of his field. Arthur said the figure was not moving at all despite the freezing temperatures and the blinding sheets of heavy snow. Silas checked the map and realized this farm was nearly 15 miles away from the first sighting of the sedan. It was impossible for someone to travel that distance on foot through a blizzard in such a short amount of time. The dispatcher began to feel a sense of unease as he looked at the blinking lights on his console screen. He decided to pull up the digital logs from the previous winter storms to see if this pattern had appeared. Dispatchers often share stories about ghost calls or strange sightings during heavy weather, but Silas usually ignored that kind of talk. He noticed a note in the archives from 1983 that mentioned a red jacket near a frozen creek bed. The similarities were enough to make him sit up straight and reach for his cold cup of black morning coffee. A third call interrupted his thoughts when a local gas station attendant reported a silent person standing by the pumps. The attendant described the individual as wearing a bright red coat that looked far too thin for the sub-zero weather. Silas asked the caller to approach the person, but the attendant refused because the stranger was behaving in a way. The person supposedly turned toward the shop window and just stared with an expression that the caller described as empty. When the deputy arrived 5 minutes later, the parking lot was empty and there were no signs of any visitors. Silas started plotting these points on a paper map of the valley to see if there was a physical connection. He used a red pen to mark the sedan, the farm, and the gas station while checking the exact times. The points formed a perfect straight line that cut across the most dangerous and uninhabited parts of the rugged mountain. This line did not follow any existing roads or hiking trails, which made the speed of the sightings even more. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty windows of the old dispatch center building office. He reached out to a retired dispatcher named Vance who had worked in the valley for over 35 years. Vance listened to the description of the red jacket and stayed silent on the other end of the phone line. The older man finally whispered that Silas should look at the logs from the Great Blizzard of 1972. Silas searched the basement archives and found a dusty folder containing handwritten notes from a very long night in December. He found a report about a missing surveyor who vanished while wearing a distinctive red parka during a record storm. The surveyor was named Elias, and he had been tasked with marking the boundary for a new high-voltage line. According to the old dispatch logs, Elias had sent a final radio transmission about getting lost in the whiteout conditions. Search teams looked for him for 3 weeks, but they never found a single trace of his gear or body. The line Silas had drawn on his map matched the exact path of the proposed power lines from that era. Every sighting from this afternoon was located at a spot where a massive steel utility tower currently stood in silence. Silas realized the figure was not walking between the locations, but was appearing at specific points along the electrical grid. He received one final call as the sun began to set behind the thick gray clouds of the dying storm. A homeowner near the end of the valley reported a man in a red jacket standing on her back porch. She said he was tapping on the glass and holding up a surveyor rod as if he were taking measurements. Silas told her to stay away from the windows and dispatched the nearest unit with a sense of urgent dread. The deputy reached the house in record time but found only a pile of snow leaning against the wooden door. There were no boots prints on the porch, and the homeowner was hiding in her bathroom with a loaded shotgun. Silas looked at his map one last time and saw the final point ended at the local main power substation. He called the utility company to warn them, but the technician said the gates were locked and the alarms silent. The storm finally broke around midnight, and the wind died down to a soft whistle through the frozen pine trees. Maintenance crews went out the following morning to clear the ice from the heavy lines near the primary mountain substation. They found a vintage surveyor rod leaning against the fence and a scrap of red fabric caught in the wire. There was no body found in the drifts, and no evidence that anyone had climbed over the high security fence. Silas kept the scrap of fabric in his desk drawer as a reminder of the pattern he found that day. He never spoke about the red jacket again, but he always watched the monitors closely whenever the snow started falling. The valley remained quiet for the rest of the winter, and the strange calls did not return to the station. Experts say that sensory deprivation during blizzards can cause groups of people to imagine similar things out of thin air. Silas knew the difference between a tired mind and a factual log of events recorded in real time on paper. He retired 3 years later and moved to a coastal town where it never snows and the sun always shines. The records of 1988 remain in the basement for the next person who might notice the strange pattern. The county museum eventually displayed a small exhibit about the surveyor who disappeared so many long decades ago in the cold. Visitors often stop to read the official reports from that night, and they wonder about the man in the red coat. Some believe that the energy from the high voltage lines acted as a conduit for a soul lost in time. Others think that the extreme weather simply bends reality in ways that the human mind cannot ever fully understand or explain. The dispatch office still uses the same map system, but the younger workers do not know about the red ink. Silas spent his final days sitting on a porch by the ocean while reading books about geography and local mountain history. He often thought about the surveyor Elias and hoped the man finally found the boundaries he was looking for that night. The red fabric in his drawer eventually faded to a dull pink, but the memory of the tapping glass remained. He knew that some mysteries are not meant to be solved by police officers or by professional search and rescue teams. The blizzard of 1988 remains a legend that grows larger every time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The station logs were digitized in the year 2010, but some of the original handwritten notes were lost during the process. Silas had made sure to photocopy the most important pages before he left the valley for the very last time ever. He sent those copies to a historical society so that the truth of the pattern would not be forgotten by history. The surveyor rod found at the substation remains in a glass case as a silent witness to a very strange afternoon. No one has seen the man in the red jacket since the power grid was upgraded in the early 90s. The wind still howls through the mountain passes, and the snow still buries the small towns under feet of frozen white powder. Every dispatcher who sits at that desk now hears the faint static on the radio during the height of a storm. They look at the screens and they watch for any calls about a man walking alone where no man should be. The legacy of the red jacket is a part of the valley now, and it will be for a long time. Silas Vance died peacefully, knowing that he had documented the impossible with the steady hand of a true professional worker. This roadside camera captured something nobody noticed. The long and winding stretch of asphalt known as Route 42 cut a lonely path through the dense pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. For miles in every direction, the landscape was dominated by ancient cedar trees and thick undergrowth that swallowed the morning light. A single automated traffic camera sat perched atop a weathered steel pole near the remote boundary of a massive state park. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor seasonal weather and road conditions. Local transportation officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant accident or a major storm was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in October of 2021, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary to any casual observer. Silas Thorne was a 34-year-old maintenance technician who worked for the Regional Department of Transportation during that year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. He was a man of habit who took pride in the technical precision required to keep the remote monitoring network alive. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange, recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated mountain pass corridor. The drive took nearly 3 hours as the elevation climbed and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of trees. Silas reached the base of the pole and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy rainstorm. Silas decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software. He wanted to make sure the optical sensor had not been damaged by the moisture or the high winds. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still properly focused. He saw the familiar gray pavement and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at high speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around it. A small white sedan was parked on the narrow shoulder of the road just past the edge of the guardrail. The car had its hazard lights on, and the driver's side door was left standing wide open toward the forest. It was an odd place to stop because the terrain was steep and there were no trails in sight. Silas felt a slight chill because that section of the highway was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if the driver was standing near the vehicle for help. The white sedan was still there, but the open door was now closed and a dark figure stood near the trunk. The figure appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and they were pulling something heavy out from the shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty camping trunk. The person in the photo was wearing a dark hooded jacket that obscured their face from the camera lens. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 4 minutes. The third photo showed the white sedan pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the mud. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the grass was still flattened near the trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the metal guardrail and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The air was cold, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the high branches of the pines. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of ferns. Silas found the camping trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and heavy branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper authorities present at the scene. He used his radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in the woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the make and the model. The officers noted that the white sedan did not have a visible rear license plate in any frame. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a sophisticated heist that left no physical evidence behind. The museum had reported a quiet break-in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the heat died down. The police realized the driver must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the road camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the white sedan. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. They found the vehicle hidden in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and overgrown weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret purchase. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance systems. He did not realize that the remote traffic camera was set to trigger every minute, regardless of any motion. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. The archives of the transportation department had captured the one moment he thought was completely private. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The state park was now safe from the looters, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely road. Sometimes, the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a watchful eye. The automated camera still stands on its steel pole and records the passage of time one frame at a time. It captures the fog and the trees and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might catch. The forest remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. This photo was recovered after everyone disappeared. The discovery of a high-resolution camera at the bottom of a shallow ravine changed the entire investigation into the missing group. A park ranger found the device while clearing brush near the edge of a popular lookout point in the late autumn. The memory card inside was perfectly preserved despite the harsh weather conditions and the physical damage to the heavy metal casing. It contained a series of photographs that documented the final hours of 4 experienced hikers who seemed to vanish without trace. Harlan Vance was a 36-year-old commercial pilot who had spent his entire life navigating the rugged coastal ranges. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Friday morning with his 3 closest friends for a planned weekend mountain trek. The weather was predicted to be clear and cool, but a sudden wall of fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean. Harlan carried a professional digital camera to document the rare flora and fauna that lived along the high-altitude rocky ridges. The forest was dense, and the air felt damp as the group started their climb toward the summit of the peak. As the group moved higher, they encountered a strange field of scorched grass that formed a perfect circle in the clearing. Harlan stopped to take several photos of the area while his friends checked their compasses, which were spinning in useless circles. They followed the path until they reached a limestone ledge that overlooked a deep valley filled with a thick violet mist. The camera recorded the group looking over the edge with expressions of confusion as they noticed a structure in the trees. Harlan noticed that the shadows on the ground were moving in the opposite direction of the sun during the afternoon hours. He decided to lead the group toward the structure to find shelter as the temperature began to drop below the freezing point. The camera captured a strange shimmer in the air that looked like heat waves rising from the cold and damp ground. A series of photos showed the hikers standing in front of a metallic doorway that was built directly into the cliffside. Harlan took a close-up shot of a control panel that featured symbols that did not match any known human language. He found a small button on the side of the panel, and the doorway opened with a silent and smooth motion. According to local archives, several people had reported seeing strange lights hovering over this specific ridge since the 1950s era. Dispatch logs from the night the group disappeared indicate that multiple residents heard a low-frequency hum coming from the mountain. Search teams arrived at the ledge 3 days later, but they found no signs of the hikers or their heavy packs. They found the camera sitting on a rock, but the tripod had been melted into a puddle of unrecognizable dark glass. Harlan had managed to trigger a burst of photos just as the group entered the dark tunnel behind the metallic door. The investigators downloaded the files and noticed a disturbing pattern in the timestamps of the final 12 images on the card. Each photo was taken exactly 1 second apart, but the position of the stars in the background shifted by several hours. A figure that was not part of the original group appeared in the corner of the frame during the last shot. The person looked like a man wearing a vintage flight suit from the 1940s, but his face was completely blank. He stood with his arms at his sides, while the hikers seemed to be frozen in place by an unseen force. The narrator of the official report described how the camera picked up a bright flash that washed out the entire sensor. Witness statements from a nearby observation post mentioned a beam of blue light that shot into the sky at that time. Harlan Vance was heard on a nearby radio frequency for a few seconds before the signal was cut off by static. He claimed that the room inside the cliff was much larger than the mountain itself and was filled with thousands of lights. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the lenses of the binoculars to shatter inside the padded carrying cases. The sheriff listened closely to the audio recovered from a small digital recorder that was also found near the damaged camera. Harlan stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was a rhythmic clicking that sounded like a clock. The pilot whispered that the man in the flight suit was pointing toward a map of the stars on the wall. He claimed that the map was moving and showed the Earth becoming smaller as the group was lifted off the ground. The clicking was persistent and moved from the recorder toward the entrance of the tunnel with a very rapid pace. The investigation into the disappearance of the group originally concluded they were victims of a sudden landslide or a tragic fall. However, the details in the recovered photos suggested that the group had stepped into a place where time did not function. Harlan had documented a physical transition from the mountain trail into a facility that should not have existed on any map. The sheriff paused the slideshow and looked at the final image, which showed a hand reaching for the camera from above. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the hand had 6 long and slender fingers with translucent skin. The final few frames on the memory card contained a distorted image of the valley as seen from a great height. Harlan managed to capture the trailhead where they had parked their car, but the vehicles looked like tiny toys in the distance. He mentioned in the audio that the air felt thin and tasted like ozone and burnt hair as they were moved. The recording ended abruptly with a loud pop and the sound of a vacuum sealing a container shut in the dark. Silence filled the evidence room as the investigators realized that the group was no longer on the mountain or the Earth. The authorities contacted a government agency that specialized in unexplained aerial phenomena to examine the metallic door and the control panel. A researcher named Silas Vance arrived at the site but found that the entrance had been replaced by solid and gray limestone. They returned to the ledge with ground-penetrating radar, but the results showed only solid rock for hundreds of feet in every direction. The desert seemed empty under the moonlight, but the feeling of a heavy and cold presence remained in the mountain air. They found a single silver button near the spot where the camera was recovered that felt warm to the touch. The photos showed blurry images of a hangar that contained several craft shaped like polished silver needles resting on the floor. One image captured Harlan looking into a mirror, but his reflection showed a man who was much older, with white hair. Silas noted that the silver button had the same symbols found on the control panel in the earlier photos on the card. They realized that the hikers had not just disappeared, but had been taken to a place where they would never age. The symbols on the button began to glow with a soft blue light when the men spoke the name of Harlan. The case remains open, but the physical evidence is kept in a vault that requires a high level of security clearance. The families of the 4 hikers often visit the trailhead to leave flowers and look at the peaks with a sense of loss. The camera serves as a haunting reminder that some places in the wilderness are not meant to be mapped by human hands. Harlan no longer flies his plane over that section of the range because his instruments always fail when he nears the ledge. The mountain remains a silent witness to the events of that night, while the photos hold the only proof of the truth. Today, no search team members dare to return to the area without full backup communication gear and armed security personnel. Silas Vance spends his nights analyzing the frequency of the hum recorded in the audio to find any hidden messages. He discovered the sound patterns match star transmissions caught by radio telescopes in other parts of the world at the same time. This suggests that whatever happened on that mountain has links to something far beyond our understanding of space and time. The silver button is kept in a lead container because it emits unstable energy that affects all nearby electronic devices. Local residents still report seeing pillars of blue light rising from the peaks whenever fog storms settle in the northern valley. Some believe the hikers are still alive and traveling among the stars on a mission that we cannot yet comprehend. For Silas and the original investigators, the photos are a warning that humans are only guests on this ancient planet. They have decided to destroy the original coordinates of the metal door so that no more lives are lost in vain. The darkness inside the cliff will remain a mystery because the mountain has closed its door with thick layers of rock. Why this mountain road is closed every winter. The high elevation passes of the northern Sierra Range are subject to weather conditions that can bury a heavy semi-truck in minutes. Local highway department records indicate that one specific stretch of blacktop near the granite peaks has remained gated since 1988. Silas Vance was 56 years old and worked as a lead safety inspector for the Regional Department of Transportation Division. He had spent 30 years evaluating road stability, but he always felt a strange pressure in his ears near the summit. Silas arrived at the lower gate during a gray morning in November with a simple goal to check the seasonal locks. The air was thin and carried the scent of frozen stone and the metallic tang of an approaching heavy snowstorm. He drove his four-wheel drive pickup toward the restricted zone and noticed the pavement was covered in thin black ice. The first strange detail was that the road surface appeared to be steaming despite the temperature being well below the freezing point. Silas saw that the heat was coming from the center line and it was melting the ice in a perfect path. He checked the thermal sensors on his dashboard and found that the asphalt was radiating nearly 90 degrees of localized heat. Silas stopped the truck and walked to the edge of the guardrail to see if there were any underground steam pipes. The maintenance logs showed no geothermal activity in this sector, and no utility lines had been buried beneath the remote mountain road. Silas looked down the steep embankment and saw that the snow was completely gone from a circular patch of rocky earth. He assumed it was a chemical reaction from the road salt, but the smell in the air was sweet and floral. An hour later, Silas found a set of heavy equipment tracks that led away from the road and into the trees. These tracks did not match any of the department plows or the standard tread of a modern commercial or civilian vehicle. Silas followed the markings for 50 yards and found a vintage surveyor rod standing upright in the middle of the brush. The metal was polished and looked brand new despite the harsh mountain environment that usually rusted iron in a single season. Silas checked the serial number on the rod and realized it belonged to a crew that vanished in 1972. That specific team had been tasked with mapping the original route before the road was paved for the local logging industry. It was impossible for the tool to be in such perfect condition after sitting in the forest for several decades. The inspector began to feel a sense of heavy static as he held the cold metal rod in his gloved hands. He decided to return to his truck and check the archived radio logs from the year the surveyor crew went missing. Silas heard a recording of a man named Elias who was calling for a location check during a sudden whiteout storm. Elias reported that the road was turning beneath his feet and that the mountain was moving like a massive living thing. Silas felt a chill when he realized the voice on the old tape sounded remarkably clear and lacked any background wind. He looked at the rod again and noticed that it was vibrating with a low frequency that made his teeth ache. The inspector realized the road was not closed because of the snow, but because of a physical displacement of space. A third anomaly appeared when Silas looked through his binoculars and saw a man in a red jacket standing on the peak. The figure was holding a transit level and appeared to be taking measurements of the clouds that were rolling over the ridge. Silas called out to the man, but the wind swallowed his voice and the figure did not turn or acknowledge him. The man moved with a rhythmic and mechanical grace that suggested he was following a very specific set of internal instructions. Silas checked the local missing person files and found a photo of Elias wearing that exact same bright red parka jacket. When Silas looked through the lenses a second time, the peak was empty and only the gray rocks remained in view. He realized the surveyor was still finishing the job he started 50 years ago during the Great Winter Blizzard. Silas started connecting the dates of the road closures with the cycles of the lunar calendar and the mountain solar flares. He used a red pen to mark the years when the department had reported seeing ghost lights on the high summit. The sightings occurred on the exact nights when the road temperature spiked and the ice began to melt from the asphalt. This pattern suggested that the mountain road was acting as a conductor for an energy source that originated deep inside. Silas felt the ground buckle slightly beneath his boots, even though the seismic monitors in the valley remained perfectly still. He realized the asphalt was not just a road, but was a seal placed over a very thin spot in reality. Silas reached out to a retired foreman who had helped pave the mountain pass back in the late 60s. The foreman listened to the description of the steam, and he told Silas to leave the summit before the sun set. The old man whispered that the road was built with a special volcanic aggregate that was supposed to prevent heavy ice. He claimed the stones were taken from a site that the local tribes had warned the engineers to leave alone forever. Silas looked back at the surveyor rod and realized the notches were moving, as if the metal were slowly breathing. Every name listed in the original crew manifest was actually a descendant of the people who once protected the high peaks. Silas found a note in the foreman diary that described a road that leads to a place without time. The surveyor, Elias, was the last person to stand on the summit before the road was officially gated and locked in '88. According to the final report, Elias had discovered that the mountain was not made of solid granite, but of hollow light. Silas realized the man in the red jacket was not a ghost, but was a part of the mountain itself. He received one final shock when he looked at his own GPS and saw his location was listed as sea level. The figure in the red jacket appeared at the edge of the woods and pointed toward the lower valley gate. Silas turned his truck around and drove down the mountain as fast as the black ice would allow him to. He realized that the ordinary mountain road was a bridge that only opened when the cold air hit the peak. Silas packed his gear and decided to report that the road was structurally unsound and should be decommissioned for public use. He called his supervisor to say that the granite was shifting and that the risk of a landslide was high. The supervisor accepted the report without any questions, as if he had been waiting for an excuse to keep it closed. Silas drove away and watched the summit disappear in the fog as the first heavy flakes of the storm fell. He kept the surveyor rod in his truck as a reminder of the man who was still measuring the peaks. He never spoke about the steam or the red jacket to the other inspectors or to the local media. The road remains closed every winter because the mountain needs to finish its work in the silence of the snow. The mystery of the mountain road remains a secret known only to those who have felt the heat of the asphalt. Experts say that the steam is caused by a natural underground spring that warms the rocks during the winter months. Silas knew the difference between a natural spring and a road that was trying to tell him a long story. He lived the rest of his life watching the mountains from the safety of the valley floor and the sun. The forest holds its secrets in the deep snow, and the wind covers the sound of the surveyor at work. The quiet warnings were real, and the road is still waiting for the next storm to open the door. Silas Vance died, knowing that some places on a map are not meant to be traveled by the living. The Department of Transportation eventually reinforced the gates and added a row of heavy concrete barriers to the entrance. They cited geological instability and unpredictable rockfalls as the primary reasons for the permanent closure of the northern pass. Silas often looked at his old field notes and wondered if the surveyor rod was still vibrating in the basement. He had noticed that the serial number on the rod matched the coordinates of the melting circle on the mountain. This suggested that the tools were not just instruments for measuring, but were anchors for a different kind of reality. The red jacket had become a legend among the younger rangers who claimed to see flashes of color in the fog. They spoke of a man who looked through a transit at things that were not yet built in the valley. Historical archives from the county museum revealed that several other roads in the region had been closed for similar reasons. Most of these trails led to ancient quarries where the stones were supposedly restless and warm even in the dead of winter. Silas had suspected that the entire mountain range was connected by a network of energy that the road had accidentally tapped. He spent his final months writing a manuscript that explained the relationship between the blizzard and the magnetic shifting. The pages were filled with diagrams of the surveyor rods and the way they aligned with the stars above. He knew that his work would likely be dismissed as the ramblings of an old man who spent too much time alone. Yet he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had documented the pattern for the next inspector. Whenever a heavy storm approaches the valley, the residents look up at the dark silhouette of the jagged mountain range. They see the faint glow of the summit, and they know that the road is busy with the work of ghosts. The snow falls in thick blankets that cover the tracks of the man in the red jacket until spring. Silas had left instructions to have his ashes scattered at the base of the ridge near the lower gate. He wanted to be part of the mountain that he had spent so many years trying to understand and map. The road is just a line on a map, but it is also a boundary between the known and the unknown. The gates remain locked, but the measurements continue every single time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The mountain is alive, and it is still waiting for the survey to be finished by the man in red. This final voicemail from a highway turnout still has no explanation. The discovery of a mobile phone at the edge of a steep embankment changed the direction of a major search. A local road worker found the device while clearing dry brush near a remote highway turnout in the late autumn season. The battery was long dead, but the internal storage remained intact and contained a single recording that baffled the local authorities. It was a 3-minute voicemail left on an answering machine that seemed to document a very strange and sudden disappearance. Lyle Vance was a 42-year-old long-haul trucker who had spent his career driving through the high desert. He arrived at the mountain pass early on a Tuesday night with the simple goal of resting before his final delivery. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Lyle expected to finish his route well before the sunrise. He carried a heavy thermos of coffee and a small notebook to record his mileage and fuel stops for the company. The highway was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of sagebrush and cold engine oil that night. As Lyle pulled his heavy silver truck into the paved turnout, he noticed a series of strange lights in the sky. He followed the flickering glow with his eyes until he reached the very edge of the gravel shoulder near the cliff. The dash cam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect a noise coming from the rear of the trailer. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the rocks near the base of peaks. He returned to the cab and checked his radio before realizing that the signal was dropping out for no clear reason. He sat in the driver's seat, and the internal microphone captured a strange humming sound that seemed to come from above. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind there. Lyle reached for his phone to call his wife and leave a quick message about the delay in his scheduled return. The voicemail began with him explaining that he saw a group of figures walking across the empty highway in the dark. His voice was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or a deep growing fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle stopped had been the site of several unexplained events since 1974. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that multiple drivers reported seeing shadows that moved without making any sound on the road. Search teams arrived at the turnout 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but they found no signs of struggle. They found his truck idling with the door wide open, but the keys were missing from the heavy metal ignition switch. Lyle left his phone on the dashboard, and it was the only piece of hardware that had a recorded file. The trucker had decided to keep the call active even when he realized that no one was picking up the phone. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the microphone picked up a rhythmic. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the truck one last time to investigate the bright glow. He walked toward the edge of the turnout and disappeared from the range of the cab lights as the clicking grew. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several long weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working player and watched the final 30 minutes of the video file with the volume up. They pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the mountain pass. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the walk of any human being. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn his wife about a sudden light. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the pavement even when the moon was hidden behind the clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mention similar shadows being seen by a group of tourists in the same mountain sector. Lyle Vance reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from starting his truck and leaving now. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the side mirrors to develop a network of cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the aluminum panels of the trailer. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a mechanism. The trucker whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high-beam lights. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the fuel to run out so the turnout would be in darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the cab with great mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Vance had originally concluded that he likely suffered a medical event and fell. However, the details on the phone suggested that the trucker was being actively followed by something that understood his equipment. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of man. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the frame of the heavy truck in the quiet night. The final few seconds of the voicemail contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the window from outside. Lyle shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the air. He mentioned that he was going to try and hide the phone so that someone would eventually find the record. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the truck horn being triggered. Silence filled the room of the station as the screen turned black without any more images of the mountain pass. The sheriff contacted the state police the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the internal storage. A technician named Silas Reed examined the digital files and confirmed that the audio had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the turnout together to look for the notebook Lyle mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the gravel that contained a series of sketches and a ring. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the jagged highway. One image captured a figure standing in the middle of the road with glowing patterns etched into its gray skin. Silas noted that the silver ring had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Lyle Vance had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that has been there. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in the light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the phone remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Lyle Vance often thinks about the quiet trucker and the warning he tried to leave for them. The video serves as a haunting reminder that the desert holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by those who drive. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind at night. The turnout remains empty and avoided by locals, but the phone still holds the final warning of 2020. Every time Silas drives past the mountain pass, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost trucker on that old phone. He kept a copy of the report in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to read it. The technician, Silas Reed, moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the highway pull-off and the lights that still appear over the mountain peaks. Lyle knew that the truth was recorded on that small device hidden at the edge of the steep drop. Today, the highway is monitored by new cameras that do not require a man to sit in a cab in dark. The turnout is paved with fresh asphalt, and the state has removed the old signs from the high mountain sector. Silas Vance spends his time working in the valley where the lights of the city keep the shadows away. He still wonders if the clicking sound he heard on the phone was a message or just the sound of time. The mountain wind continues to blow dust against the truck stop while the memory of the driver fades into history. Some things are not meant to be recorded by a man who is just trying to get home to his family. Lyle Vance left his voice behind to tell a story that the desert tried to bury in the rocks long ago. The phone remains the only witness to a night that ended with a flash of light and a cold room. He is gone, but the recording continues to play for those who are brave enough to listen to the truth. The high desert is a place of long shadows and deep silence that can swallow a man and truck. We may never know what Lyle saw through the glass of the truck, but we have his voice to guide us. The warning is there for anyone who finds themselves alone in the dark near the old mountain highway in the sand. He was just a driver doing his job when the world changed and the lights came down from the sky. The routine ended, but the story of the recording will live as long as the memory of the turnout. The truth is still out there, waiting for the next person to pull over and look into the dark trees. The silence of the high desert is never truly empty when you listen to the static on the old radio bands. Silas Reed still looks at the stars and wonders if Lyle is out there looking back at the bright city. The silver ring sits in a velvet box and refuses to lose its strange and cold glow in the night. The investigation is over, but the mystery of the highway turnout will never be solved by the men on Earth. It is a story that belongs to the wind and the stars and the man who left his phone behind. We are all just travelers on a road that leads into the unknown parts of the vast and empty world. Lyle Vance was the first to find the secret, and he will not be the last to see the light. The highway remains open, but the turnout is a place where the shadows move with a life of their own. Listen to the wind when you drive through the mountains, and you might hear the clicking sound of the desert. It is the sound of a secret that has been kept for a very long time by the old rocks. The story of Lyle Vance is a reminder that we are never truly alone, even in the most remote places. The final voicemail is a bridge between our world and the one that exists just beyond the reach of lights. We should be careful where we choose to rest when the sun goes down and the desert starts to speak. The light is beautiful, but it carries a price that some men are not prepared to pay in the end. Lyle paid that price, and his voice is all that remains of his long journey through the dark mountain pass. The road goes on forever, but some drivers never reach the end of the line because of the lights. Keep your eyes on the road and do not look too long into the shadows of the high desert. The truth is there, but it is hidden in the static and the clicking of the old magnetic tapes. Silas Vance knows this, and that is why he stays in the city where the lights never go out. The mountain is waiting for the next truck to pull over and listen to the humming in the air. Be safe on the highway and remember the name of the man who tried to warn us all that night. The story of the missing trucker is a tale that will be told as long as people drive. There is no explanation for the voicemail, but there is a lesson in the silence that follows the loud click. We are just small parts of a much larger mystery that is unfolding every night in the dark woods. The highway turnout is a doorway, and Lyle Vance was the one who walked through it into the unknown. We have the recording, and that is enough to know that the desert is alive with a strange power. The mystery remains, and the world continues to turn while the stars watch over the empty and quiet road. Silas closes his eyes and hears the voice of his friend calling out from the distance of the stars. The end of the story is just the beginning of a much larger journey for those who are taken. We will wait for the next sign and hope that we are ready for the light when it comes. The highway is long, and the night is deep, and the secrets are many in the high mountain pass. Be careful where you stop, because you might not be the only one looking for a place to rest. The voicemail is the only thing that is left of a man who saw too much. It is a warning that we should all heed when we find ourselves alone on the road. The truth is out there, and it is waiting for the next recording to begin in dark. Silas Reed knows the truth, and he will never return to the highway turnout in the desert. The story is finished, but the mystery will live on in the hearts of those who listen. Lyle Vance is gone, but his voice will never be forgotten by the people who find the phone. The desert has spoken, and the recording is the final word on the matter of the lights. This isolated church has a long history. The historic stone chapel, located on the high ridge of the Northern Valley, remained a silent witness to the local history. A heavy oak door stood in the darkest corner of the eastern transept to protect the original property deeds and maps. This facility was a critical link for the Parish Heritage Board because it provided the only physical evidence for the building. For 70 years, the archive operated without a single major incident until a Friday in November of 2022. On that day, the building recorded a sequence of structural shifts that defied every known engineering model used by the office. Lyle Vance was a 46-year-old historical preservation officer who worked for the regional government during that busy year. His primary job involved reviewing the weekly building reports to ensure the foundations remained stable against the shifting mountain groundwater. Lyle enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the hidden corners of the town buildings. He was a man of meticulous detail who could spot a hairline fracture in 1,000 square feet of ancient stone. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific vibration sensor was experiencing a strange recurring calibration error. The descent took nearly 10 minutes as the air grew colder and the dim lights flickered over the damp walls. Lyle reached the end of the hall and connected his diagnostic tablet to the monitoring port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the data logs were almost full of movement alerts that should have been ignored by the software. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of seismic readings taken during a recent light rain. Lyle decided to download the final batch of sensor data before he cleared the memory and reset the internal hardware. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the event logs to ensure the equipment was anchored. He saw the familiar baseline readings and the small spikes caused by the passing of heavy trucks on the road. One log from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the pressure signature looked different from the data around it. A massive weight had been applied to the internal side of the sealed wall just past the edge of the frame. The sensor recorded a steady push that lasted for exactly 5 minutes before the entire system went dark for a second. Lyle felt a slight chill because that section of the church was known for being a completely dead zone for signals. He clicked on the next file in the sequence to see if the building had shifted again during the night shift. The pressure was still there, but the sensor reading was now pulsing and a low-frequency hum stood near the frequency. The force appeared to be originating from deep beneath the floor, and it was pulling something heavy out from the dark. Lyle zoomed in on the digital waves until he could see the silhouette of a large and repeating vibration. He checked the timestamps and realized that the event had been at that specific location for less than 10 minutes total. The third log showed the pressure dropping back to 0 and leaving nothing but a flat line in the file. Lyle looked toward the actual wall in the corner and saw that the mortar seal was still perfectly intact today. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished now. The air was stagnant, and the only sound was the hum of the ventilation fans echoing through the empty corridor. The floor was dry from the recent summer heat, and he noticed thin cracks in the stone where the wall met. He followed the line for about 5 feet until he reached a small gap hidden behind a stack of metal shelves. Lyle found a heavy iron latch tucked under a layer of thick dust and cobwebs that looked intentionally placed long ago. He reached down to touch the cold metal surface and saw that the heavy bolt was sealed with industrial wax. A faint smell of sulfur hung in the heavy air, and Lyle immediately pulled his hand back in sudden realization. He used his portable radio to contact the main office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious architectural anomaly today. Within an hour, 2 structural engineers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with bright orange plastic tape. They asked Lyle to show them the sensor logs on his tablet so they could identify the source of force. The engineers noted that the hidden hallway did not have a registered blueprint in any of the municipal archive books here. They carefully scraped the wax on the latch and discovered several rusted ventilation pipes from a forgotten early 20th century. The local museum had reported a missing set of original town founding documents 3 months earlier, but the police had nothing. These papers were extremely valuable, and a former clerk had likely hidden them in the wall until the investigation closed now. The engineers realized the thief must have used the old vault room to hide the stolen property behind the wall. They analyzed the sensor data from other units along the foundation to track the path of the subtle structural shifts. This lead eventually took them to a small residential house located 2 blocks over from the edge of the park. Inside the house, the authorities found more documents that had been taken during the same period earlier that same year. The suspect had been living there under a false name while he waited for a collector to finalize a secret sale. One of the men was a former janitor who knew exactly how to access the sub-basement without triggering alarms. He did not realize that the new vibration sensors were set to record every movement regardless of the weight or size. His simple mistake of leaning against the hidden latch had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. Lyle returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details today. Most people would have deleted the error logs without looking at the data because it was a routine maintenance job. The historical records were now safe from the thief, and the original deeds were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the municipal buildings and always looked a little closer at the logs from the basements. Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving too fast. The hidden latch still stands in its dark corner and records the passage of time 1 minute at a time now. It sits behind the metal shelves and the occasional staff member who travels through the silence of the lower levels. No one ever suspects that a simple sensor could be the most important witness to a crime in the building. Lyle knows that every data log tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look today. He walks the halls with a new perspective and watches the digital monitors for anything else the system catches. The federal investigation into the document theft revealed that the suspects had intended to sell the items on the market. This operation would have stripped the town of its legal history and compromised the property rights of many local families. The recovery of the original land survey maps ensured that several ongoing legal disputes could be settled with accurate evidence. Lyle received a formal commendation from the mayor for his role in preserving the heritage of the entire valley community. He often shares the story of the hidden hallway with new preservation officers as a lesson in professional diligence. The quiet church stands on the hill and continues to serve the families as it has for many generations now. Visitors admire the architecture and the stained glass windows without knowing the secret that was hidden deep beneath the floor. The story of the vibration sensor and the iron latch has become a local legend among the town residents today. Most people walk past the oak door in the transept without realizing its significance in the history of the parish. For Lyle, the sound of the wind against the limestone will always be a reminder of the hidden truths. The truth about what happened on that Friday in October remains locked away in boxes of redacted paperwork and files. The people of the Quiet Valley continue their lives while the mystery of the church hallway hangs over the town. It is a reminder that some things are captured by the machines that are never meant to be understood by humans. Lyle continues to keep his watch from a distance, knowing that the sensors will eventually trigger another silent alarm today. The silence of the basement is never truly empty when the sensors are the only ones left to listen. The archives of the town recorded the passage of time as the seasons changed from the heat of the summer. The limestone walls of the old chapel remained strong against the wind that blew across the high ridge of the mountain. Lyle often looks at the digital feed from the sensors on his tablet while he sits in his quiet office. He knows that the history of the town is safe as long as someone is willing to watch the data. The record of the world continues to grow one frame at a time for anyone who cares to look. The structural engineers completed their final report on the hidden corridor and the forgotten vault room in the sub-basement. They found that the original construction had been modified several times during the early part of the 20th century. These changes were never added to the official maps of the town or the blueprints of the historic limestone chapel. This lack of information provided the perfect hiding place for someone who wanted to keep a secret in the dark. The discovery of the iron latch was a turning point in the investigation into the missing regional property deeds. The former janitor was arrested and charged with the theft of several state documents that were over 80 years old. He had been planning to move the items to a secondary location when the vibration sensor recorded his presence today. The evidence from the digital logs was a critical part of the case presented by the local district attorney. The community was relieved to know that the history of their homes and lands was once again secure in archives. Lyle continues to perform his duties with a sense of purpose that comes from knowing he made a difference. The story of the isolated church and its hidden history serves as a reminder of the value of the archives. It shows that even the most mundane data can hold the key to solving a mystery from the recent past. The machines that monitor our world are silent witnesses to the actions of the people who move through it. We may not always see the cameras or the sensors, but they are recording the truth 1 second at a time. For the residents of the valley, the stone chapel is more than just a place of quiet reflection now. The preservation of history requires the constant attention of people like Lyle Vance, who value the details of the world. He remains a dedicated officer who understands that the past is a foundation for the future of the quiet town. The record of the hidden hallway is a permanent part of the digital logs stored in the local government office. It will be there for the next generation of technicians to find when they perform their routine maintenance checks. The history of the church is written in the stone and preserved in the silent data of the sensors. Park rangers were told never to open this gate. The presence of a rusted steel gate deep within the national forest remains one of the most persistent mysteries among the local maintenance crews. This barrier stands at the end of a forgotten access road that the Park Service stopped maintaining over 40 years ago for unknown reasons. Senior rangers often pass down a verbal warning to every new recruit that the lock on the chain must never be cut or replaced. The gate is marked with a simple sign that says authorized personnel only, but no official record exists of what lies on the other side. Silas Vance was a 39-year-old trail maintenance supervisor who spent his decade of service repairing the remote backcountry paths. He arrived at the northern boundary line early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of clearing the fallen timber from the winter storms. The weather was unusually calm for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his clearing work before the heavy fog arrived. He carried a heavy-duty chainsaw and a metal detector to locate any buried survey markers that might have shifted during the recent mudslides. The forest was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp moss and old cedar wood that had started to rot. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of mountain laurel, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of an old asphalt road. He followed the cracked pavement until he saw the silhouette of a heavy black gate that was chained shut with a thick iron lock. The metal was pitted with deep rust, and the surrounding trees had started to grow through the bars of the structure over the many years. Silas stepped toward the barrier and felt the ground vibrate slightly as a low humming sound echoed from the dark valley beyond the hills. He noticed that the chain was cold to the touch, and the lock appeared to be fused together by some kind of intense heat. He pushed the gate and noticed a strange scent of ozone and sulfur hanging heavy in the air on the other side of the road. A thick layer of white ash covered the ground and every surface, but the trees beyond the gate looked surprisingly vibrant and healthy. Silas approached a small stone building that sat 50 yards past the entrance and saw a series of radio antennas pointing toward the sky. He found a small wooden box resting beside the front door with a handwritten label that simply said, "Do not enter under any circumstances." The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a person who was working under a great deal of stress. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific sector was a man named Elias Thorne in 1978. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his radio checks after reporting a series of bright lights over the ridgeline. Search teams combed the surrounding woods for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing ranger or his Park Service vehicle at all. Silas picked up the wooden box and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire abandoned station area. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man who was told to guard this gate. The supervisor decided to bring the box back to his truck to see if the contents contained any clues about the missing ranger. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back through the dense brush while the sun began to dip below the sharp mountain peaks. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to open the container and discover why the area had been kept secret for so many decades. He drove back to the main station in silence and immediately began searching for any historical maps of the northern boundary sector. The station was quiet as he sat at his desk and noticed the flickering fluorescent lights reflecting off the metal surface of the box. Silas eventually found a small key inside the desk drawer and used it to pry open the lid of the wooden container that evening. He pulled out a small leather journal and began to read the first entry by the light of his small desk lamp. A voice in his head seemed to form as he read about a series of metallic objects appearing in the valley behind the gate. The man in the journal claimed that the objects were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft or military technology. He wrote with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer who was familiar with the typical wildlife of the mountains. The narrator described how the metallic objects would hover over the peaks for hours before disappearing into the deep granite caves that lined the valley walls. Witness statements from 1978 mention similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that same late summer month. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the ground beneath the black steel gate every single night. He believed that something was living deep inside the mountain and was using the radio antennas to signal others out in the dark sky. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass lenses of his binoculars to shatter in his hands while he watched. Silas read closely as the journal captured the description of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the small stone observation building. Elias stopped writing for several hours, and the next entry was a frantic scrawl that was almost impossible to read in the dim light. The ranger wrote that he could see tall figures moving through the trees without making any sound or breaking any of the dry branches. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for him to open the gate so they could move their equipment further into the forest. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the roof of the cabin with a very terrifying and fluid speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from a mental break and wandered into the ravine. However, the details in the journal suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his life and the park. Silas paused his reading and looked at the date on the final page, which was the night before Elias Thorne vanished from the forest. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the description of the thumping in the journal matched a sound he heard. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the heavy chain of the black gate back at the northern boundary. The final few paragraphs of the journal contained a frantic description of the valley being filled with a bright and blinding blue light. Elias shouted through his pen that the humming sound was vibrating his bones and making his vision blur from the sheer physical pressure. He mentioned that he was going to lock the wooden box and hide it near the door before the figures reached the station. The writing ended abruptly with a long ink smear across the page and the sound of a heavy metallic crash recorded in his memory. Silence filled the office of Silas as he closed the journal and looked out at the dark and empty forest in the distance. Silas contacted the regional director the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the wooden box near the hidden gate. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the journal and confirmed that the paper and ink matched the official supplies used in 1978. They returned to the site of the gate together to look for the Park Service vehicle that Elias Thorne had been driving that year. The woods seemed different under the gray morning light, but the feeling of being watched by something unseen remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal tag buried in the dirt that contained the serial number of the missing truck and a silver ring. The blueprints of the area showed detailed diagrams of a tunnel system that extended several miles beneath the mountain and into the restricted valley sector. One image captured a large circular structure that was not part of any original Park Service engineering plans for the northern boundary or roads. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any known human language or culture. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply walked away, but had been taken into a place that existed far beneath the mountain peaks. The symbols on the ring began to glow with a soft light when the men brought it near the gate. The authorities sealed the road leading to the northern boundary with a thick layer of concrete and new warning signs to prevent any trespassing. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for anyone who found the box. The journal serves as a haunting reminder that some gates are kept locked for a very specific and dark reason that we may never understand. He no longer works on the backcountry trails because the low humming sound still echoes in his ears whenever the forest gets too quiet. The gate remains locked and forgotten by the public, but the forest still holds the secret of what happened in 1978. Every time Silas looks at the northern ridge, he remembers the frantic handwriting of the lost ranger named Elias Thorne in that old journal. He kept a photocopy of the pages in a secure file, but he rarely has the courage to look at the final ink smear again. The researcher, Marcus Reed, resigned from his position shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring or the symbols. Local legends continue to grow about the locked gate and the blue lights that still appear over the peaks during the summer. Silas knows that the truth is buried deep in the granite, where the vibrations never truly stopped moving through the mountain and trees. In this new story, archived winter summaries across several mountain districts mention a cluster of December disappearances that occurred in remote forest corridors during severe cold snaps. None of the cases shared confirmed connections, yet the patterns unsettled investigators because each incident involved travelers who vanished within narrow windows of time and distance. Locals across distant counties traded similar warnings about isolated routes that turned unpredictable once deep winter settled over the landscape. Maeve Corbin, a 35-year-old contract cartographer, drove into one of those regions during early December while updating wildfire access maps before heavy storms closed the mountain roads. Her assignment required photographing trail markers, verifying creek crossings, and checking outdated maintenance routes. She expected a calm day because forecasts predicted only light snow with no major wind. She carried her camera bag, a roll of updated charts, and a small thermos she rarely traveled without. The forest road twisted between steep ridges where the sky looked pale and flat. Patches of ice crept across the asphalt, which forced her to reduce speed. She passed a faded sign warning that plows rarely reached beyond the next junction. A second sign hung loosely along a bent post announcing road closures from mid-month onward. She knew officials planned to block the route soon, but she needed one final survey before seasonal shutdown. After an hour, she reached a narrow turnout where a wooden information board leaned forward as if pushed by years of storms. She stepped out to photograph the area and noticed several footprints leading toward a slope behind the turnout. The prints appeared fresh, which surprised her because no vehicles had passed during her entire drive. She followed the tracks for several yards before they disappeared into a cluster of spruce where snow thickened unexpectedly. Maeve returned to her truck just as wind brushed across the ridge. She climbed back in, warmed her hands near the heater, and drove deeper along the route until she reached a rusted trail gate chained open for winter access. Beyond it, the trees grew denser while the road narrowed. She stopped again when she spotted a small backpack lying upright near a drainage ditch. The sight made her uneasy because the pack looked recently dropped. She examined the backpack carefully. Inside, she found a half-frozen water bottle, an outdated trail map, and a name tag belonging to someone who reportedly passed through the region earlier that week. Local bulletins had mentioned a hiker who turned back during a sudden snow squall, then never returned to town. The match between the name and the story sent a chill through her despite the insulated gloves she wore. She wrote the coordinates in her notebook, then scanned the surrounding woods. Snow fell lightly, which muted the forest until everything felt distant. Wind carried faint creaks from trees shifting under frost. She called out, "Anyone here?" even knowing the chances of hearing a reply were low. Her voice vanished into the branches almost instantly. As she prepared to leave the area, she noticed a strip of reflective tape fixed high on a pine trunk. The tape looked newer than the map in the backpack, which puzzled her because crews rarely mark trees during winter. She photographed the tape, then moved closer to investigate. Behind the trunk, she found a narrow footpath nearly hidden under fresh snow. The path sloped downward toward a shallow ravine. Maeve followed it only briefly because she wanted to finish her official survey before exploring more. She drove another mile until the road opened into a broad meadow where the wind carried powder across the ground in thin streams. The sky darkened earlier than expected, which hinted at an incoming front. She stopped near an old ranger's shed leaning crookedly against a boulder. The door hung half open as if someone entered recently. Inside, she discovered a battered notebook full of field notes from a ranger patrol several years earlier. The writer described multiple strange findings across the region, including abandoned campsites, missing equipment caches, and faint tracks that vanished mid-trail. One entry mentioned hearing rhythmic knocks in a valley that appeared empty at the time. Another referred to sudden temperature drops in sheltered areas that normally stayed warm due to thick tree coverage. A gust of wind pushed snow into the shed, which made her step outside. She noticed a distant flash of movement between the tree line and the meadow. It looked like someone crossing the clearing quickly. She called out again, but received no answer. She recorded the direction in her notes because the movement matched earlier reports about people seen shortly before storms swept through. She returned to her truck and continued along the route until she reached a steep descent toward a river crossing. The radio crackled with faint static as she drove into the low ground. The river froze early this year, which formed jagged ridges of ice near the bank. She parked near the bridge, which creaked under layers of frost. The scene felt isolated enough to raise her vigilance. She scanned the area and saw a small pile of orange fabric caught in a brush cluster. She approached and found a torn piece of a high-visibility jacket. The fabric pattern matched gear often used by volunteer search teams. She collected the fragment, sealed it in a small evidence pouch, and wrote the discovery in her notebook. A trail of shallow footprints stretched from the fabric toward the riverbank, then curved sharply uphill toward dense vegetation. Maeve followed the trail, which led to an open section of forest where trees grew in uneven clusters. The air felt colder here, even though the wind paused briefly. She heard a faint, repetitive sound that resembled metal shifting. The pattern echoed irregularly, which made her wonder if it came from old equipment hidden somewhere beneath the snow. She swept her flashlight across the branches and noticed more reflective tape placed higher than typical trail markers. She recorded the placements, which formed a rough arc around the clearing. The arrangement looked intentional rather than random. She moved farther into the trees and found a narrow ravine where the snowpack appeared disturbed. Several sets of tracks converged into the ravine, though none continued beyond it. It looked as if multiple individuals descended the ravine, yet never climbed out. She crouched to examine the slope and noticed faint indentations almost hidden beneath the surface. They resembled pressure marks left by equipment pulled along the ground. She brushed away a patch of snow and revealed a rusted metal rung embedded into the soil. The rung looked like part of an old ascent ladder used during past forestry projects. She tugged on it lightly and felt a hollow space beneath. Her pulse quickened as she realized a buried structure might exist under the ravine. Old industrial tunnels or storm shelters sometimes collapsed, then filled with soil and ice. She considered climbing down for a clearer look, but the ground felt unstable. A deep vibration traveled through the slope, which convinced her to back away. The vibration lasted several seconds, then faded like a distant machine shutting down. She returned to her truck and drove toward a higher junction where she could regain radio contact. However, the snow thickened into a white curtain, which limited visibility to a few yards. The approaching storm arrived earlier than predicted, which forced her to stop near a rock outcrop. She checked her maps and found an old maintenance spur branching off the main route. She considered waiting the storm out inside her truck, but the wind intensified until the vehicle rocked gently. She turned onto the spur, hoping to reach a sheltered runoff area. Halfway up the incline, she saw a flickering light near a line of trees. The light pulsed slowly as if signaling through heavy snowfall. She thought it might be a lost hiker or a stranded motorist, so she parked and stepped out with her flashlight raised high. She moved closer and saw the light belonged to a small lantern hanging from a branch. The lantern's flame flickered erratically despite the wind. Beneath it, a message scratched into bark read, "Shelter Line West, Trail 2." She took a picture of the message because the direction did not match any current maps. Before she could investigate further, she heard another vibration behind her. This time, the sound clearly resembled metal scraping across stone. She turned to see a dark outline shift along the ridge, though the storm blurred the details. The shape moved slowly, then vanished behind a curtain of snow. She backed toward her truck, but stopped when she noticed another set of footprints near the lantern. The steps looked fresher than those near the ravine, which meant someone recently walked this route during the worsening storm. Maeve followed the footprints along the spur, which led her to an exposed slope overlooking a deep bowl-shaped corridor. The wind calmed momentarily, which gave her a clear view of the valley floor. She saw multiple patterns carved into the snow, which resembled rows of long trenches or paths created by dragging equipment. At the far end of the bowl, a faint orange glow flickered near the base of a cliff. She zoomed in with her camera and captured several photos. The glow pulsed in a steady sequence, which reminded her of security beacons or signal flares. She lowered the camera as another vibration traveled through the ground. Snow along the slope shifted slightly, which convinced her to retreat before a slide occurred. She drove back toward the main route and reached a narrow ridge where the wind finally eased enough for her to regain partial radio contact. She relayed her findings to a dispatch operator who promised to send search teams when conditions improved. She continued toward the junction when she saw a lone figure standing near a marker post. She slowed her vehicle and opened the window to call out, but the figure turned and walked toward a thicket without responding. She parked and followed on foot with her flashlight directed forward. The figure disappeared behind clusters of fir trees which bent under the weight of snow. She searched the area for several minutes until she found a scrap of fabric caught on a branch. The material matched the torn jacket found near the river, which meant she followed the same person or someone wearing similar gear. She marked the area on her map and returned to her truck as the storm thickened again. By the time she reached town, she felt exhausted from navigating through swirling ice and limited visibility. She handed her notes and photographs to local authorities who launched a coordinated search involving multiple teams. Over the next days, crews uncovered signs of old subterranean structures near the ravine and discovered collapsed ventilation shafts hidden under decades of soil. They found fragments of cold-weather clothing near one shaft, which suggested at least one traveler entered the area recently. Searchers also found pieces of rusted metal aligned in patterns that matched the long trenches Maeve captured in her photos. Engineers believed the structures belonged to a decades-old survey project abandoned after repeated cave-ins and safety violations. Thick snowfall and unstable terrain hid the remains until small shifts exposed parts during recent storms. Despite extensive searches, none of the recent missing individuals were recovered. Their tracks led toward the ravine, then vanished. Officials installed warning signs along the entire route and restricted access to the bowl-shaped corridor where the vibrations continued intermittently throughout the season. Acoustic equipment detected low-frequency pulses beneath the ground, though investigators could not confirm their source. Maeve continued her mapping work for the region but avoided the specific corridor after her report. She believed the December disappearances connected to the unstable subsurface network and shifting snow patterns that revealed and concealed pathways unpredictably. She often thought about the lantern hanging from the tree and the carved message pointing toward a shelter line no longer marked on any map. Locals still warn travelers each December about remote areas with unexplained vibrations and old structures hidden under winter snow. They recount stories about lights flickering near forgotten corridors and figures moving between trees just before storms intensify. Each tale differs slightly, yet the core remains the same. Some December nights, the forest feels alive with echoes of routes built long before current maps existed. And sometimes footsteps lead into valleys where wind and snow erase each trace within minutes, leaving only cold silence across remote America.